Let's be honest, Incoterms are boring. If you're an importer growing a business, you want to focus on product, marketing and sales. You don't want to read a 100-page rulebook from the International Chamber of Commerce. Today we're going to do something different. We aren't going to read the textbook definitions. If you wanted that, you could just go to Wikipedia. Instead, we're going to walk through the supply chain together, mentally traveling from the factory floor in China or Vietnam, across the ocean all the way to your warehouse door. We're going to stop at every single term along the way. I'll explain exactly what it means in plain English, I'll tell you the horror stories of how it fails in the real world, and then I'm going to give you my honest, unfiltered opinion on whether you should actually use it. So grab a coffee, we have a lot of ground to cover. This is the definitive operational guide to Incoterms 2020. Let's start our journey at the very beginning. The goods have been manufactured. They are boxed, palleted, and sitting on the concrete floor of the seller's factory. This brings us to the first and perhaps most misunderstood term in the book, Ex Works. In the industry, we often call Ex Works the lazy seller's term. Imagine the seller calls you up and says, "The goods are done. They're sitting in the back corner of my warehouse. Come get them." Under Ex Works, that is the extent of their obligation. They don't have to load the truck. They don't have to clear customs. They don't have to do anything except unlock the door. You, the buyer, bear all the risk and all the cost from the moment you step onto their property. Now you might be thinking, well, that sounds great. I get the lowest possible price because I'm doing all the work. But let me tell you the classic Ex Works nightmare story. You hire a trucking company to pick up a heavy industrial machine from a supplier in Shanghai. The driver arrives. Now, this driver is just the driver. He has a truck, not a crane. He looks at the machine, looks at the loading dock, and realizes he can't move it. The supplier says, "Oh, don't worry about it. Our guys are here, we'll load it for you." The supplier's employee hops on their forklift, picks up your machine, drives it to the edge of the dock, and whoops! The hydraulics slip, or he hits a bump and smash. The machine falls 3 feet onto the pavement. It is destroyed. Now, logic tells you that the supplier should pay for that, right? It was their employee on their property driving their forklift. But under strict Ex Works rules, you are the one writing the check. Why? Because delivery technically occurred the moment they made the goods available to you in the warehouse. The risk transferred to you before the loading process began. Legally, that was your machine that their guy dropped. You have to pay for the broken goods, and you have no recourse. And it gets worse. There is a compliance trap here too. If you're buying Ex Works from a foreign country, you are technically the exporter of record. But if you are a US company, you don't have a Chinese tax ID. You cannot legally file the export declaration in China. So you end up having to hire third-party agents to essentially borrow a license or act on your behalf. It is messy, it is expensive, and it puts you in legal jeopardy. So, what is the verdict on Ex Works? Don't use it. Unless you are buying a small parcel that a courier like FedEx or DHL is picking up from the reception desk, Ex Works is a liability nightmare for international trade. So, if Ex Works is bad, what should you use instead? You use the upgrade, FCA, which stands for Free Carrier. Specifically, you want to ask for FCA seller's premises. This is almost identical to Ex Works, but it fixes the two biggest problems we just talked about. First, under FCA, the seller is responsible for loading the goods onto your truck. That means if they drop the forklift during loading, it is their problem, not yours. Risk only transfers to you once the goods are safely sitting on the wheels of your truck. Second, under FCA, the seller is responsible for export customs clearance. They have the license, they speak the language, they talk to the government. They handle the paperwork, which is exactly how it should be. If you want to control your own shipping costs, which I highly recommend, FCA is the gold standard. It protects you from the loading accidents and it keeps the compliance work with the seller. Okay, the goods are on the truck. They're leaving the factory safely. Now we need to get them out of the country and across the ocean. This is where things get a little confusing because the rulebook splits into two families, the maritime terms and the multimodal terms. And this is where 90% of importers make a mistake simply out of habit. let's talk about the most famous term in the world, FOB, or free on board. Everyone feels safe with FOB, FOB. You see FOB Shanghai or FOB Shenzhen on almost every invoice. The definition seems simple. The seller clears the goods for export and pays to get them onto the vessel. The moment the goods cross the ship's rail and sit on the deck, the risk passes to you. You pay for the ocean freight. It sounds fair, but here is the problem. FOB was designed for the days of sailing ships, barrels of oil, and sacks of grain. It was designed for bulk cargo. But you are probably shipping containers, and containers do not work like bulk cargo. Think about the process. You don't drive a container straight onto the ship. The truck driver drops a container off at a terminal or a container yard. That container might sit in a stack in the mud or snow or baking sun for 3, 4, maybe 5 days waiting for the vessel to arrive. Here is the FOB trap. If you use FOB, the seller is responsible until the goods are on board the ship. You're responsible once they are on board. But who is responsible while it sits in the terminal stack for 5 days? If a terminal crane knocks over your stack and crushes your container before the ship arrives, you enter a legal black hole called the risk gap. The seller argues, I'm not liable, it wasn't on the ship yet. You argue, I'm not liable, I don't control the terminal. You end up in a finger-pointing match while your goods are destroyed. The International Chamber of Commerce actually specifically advises against using FOB for containerized freight for this exact reason. So what's the alternative? We go back to our friend FCA. I know we used FCA at the factory, but FCA is flexible. You can use FCA Port Terminal. This rule says that risk transfers when the seller hands the container to the carrier, meaning when the truck driver drops it off at the terminal gate. Bam! Gap closed. If you use FCA Terminal, risk transfers the moment the container enters the yard. If the terminal crushes it, it is clearly your risk, which means your insurance policy is triggered immediately, without any arguments. It is cleaner, safer, and legally precise. Now, before we move on, I have to mention one other term in this family just so you know what it is, and that is FAS, free alongside ship. This is an old school term where the seller dumps the goods on the dock right next to the boat. Unless you are chartering a barge to move loose coal or grain, you can completely ignore this one. You will never use it for general merchandise. So far, we've talked about scenarios where you, the buyer, are paying for the main ocean shipping. But what if you want the seller to handle that? What if you want a price that includes shipping to your country? This brings us to the C terms. And I want you to listen very closely here because this is where the scams happen. The most common term you will see is CIF, CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. Under CIF, the seller hires the shipping line, pays the freight to your port, and buys an insurance policy for you. It sounds convenient. But if you're shipping LCL, that's less than container load, where your goods share a container with others, you need to be terrified of CIF. Here is the LCL scam. You find a supplier who says, hey, give me the order and I'll give you CIF New York prices. I'll even do the shipping for free. You think, wow, free shipping? That's amazing. Friends, there is no such thing as free shipping. Here is what is actually happening. The seller is using a budget freight forwarder who offers them a kickback to get the cargo. The seller pays nothing. But when that ship arrives in New York, the destination agent takes your cargo hostage. They will issue an invoice for destination surcharges, handover fees, or China import service fees. I have seen these bills. They can be $500, $1,000, sometimes 3 times the cost of your actual freight. And you cannot negotiate. They have your goods, you pay the ransom, or you lose the shipment. So the verdict? Never use CIF for LCL shipments. It's a trap. Always control the freight yourself using FCA so you know the true cost up front. There is another issue with CIF, and that is the insurance. Under the rules, a seller using CIF only has to buy Clause C insurance. That is the bare minimum coverage. It covers the ship sinking or burning down. Do you know what it doesn't cover? It doesn't cover theft. It doesn't cover water damage from a leaky container. It doesn't cover rough handling. If you buy a container of iPhones on CIF terms and the container arrives but the doors have been pried open and the boxes are empty, Clause C insurance pays you $0. you're totally exposed. So if CIF is dangerous, what is the modern alternative? You should be using CIP, CIP, Carriage and Insurance Paid To. CIP is the multimodal twin of CIF. The money works the same way, the seller pays the freight. But there are two massive upgrades. First, risk transfers when the goods are handed to the carrier, not when they get on the boat. That solves the terminal risk gap we talked about earlier. Second, and this is huge, in the 2020 update, the rules changed for CIP. Now, if a seller uses CIP, they're legally required to provide Institute Cargo Clauses A insurance. Clause A is all risk coverage. It covers theft, it covers breakage, it covers water damage. So if you want the seller to arrange shipping and insurance, do not ask for CIF, ask for CIP, your pool. You get the same convenience, but with much better insurance and clearer liability rules. Alright, we have crossed the ocean. The ship has docked in your country. Now we need to get the goods off the ship, through customs, and to your warehouse door. This brings us to the arrival terms, or the D group. First up is DAP, delivered at place. This is what I consider the sweet spot for many importers who want a hands-off experience. Under DAP, the seller pays for everything, the freight, the insurance, the trucking, right up to your warehouse dock. But there are two very important caveats. Number one, the seller does not unload the truck. The driver backs up to your dock, opens the doors and says, "It's all yours." You have to get the forklift and get the goods off. Number two, the seller does not pay the import duties or taxes. You, the buyer, are responsible for customs clearance and paying the VAT or duties. And honestly, this is exactly what you want. We'll get to why in a second. Next, we have a term that is a bit of a niche player, DPU, delivered at place unloaded. This is the only Incoterm in the entire book where the seller is responsible for unloading the goods. Why would you use this? Well, imagine you are managing a construction project. You're importing a massive industrial generator to a bare dirt lot. You don't have a forklift, you don't have a loading dock, you don't have a crane. You need the delivery truck to have its own crane to set the generator on the ground. In that specific case, you use DPU. It forces the seller to hire a specialized vehicle to offload the cargo. But unless you have that specific need, stick to DAP. Finally, we arrive at the most tempting and most dangerous term for Western B2B importers, DDP, Delivered Duty Paid. DDP is the Amazon Prime experience. The seller does absolutely everything. They pay the freight, the trucking, the insurance, and crucially, they pay the import customs duties and the VAT or value-added tax. Business owners love DDP because it looks like a landed cost. You write one check and the goods just appear. But if you're in the UK or Europe, DDP is a tax trap. Let me explain the fiscal black hole. In Europe and the UK, you pay VAT, usually around 20% on imports. But as a registered business, you can usually claim that VAT back from the government. It's an input tax. However, to claim it back, you need the import tax certificate. If you ship DDP, the seller pays the VAT. But the Chinese or American seller is not a VAT registered entity in your country. They paid the tax, but they can't reclaim it. So what do? They pass that cost on to you. They bake that 20% into the unit price of your goods. So you're effectively paying the 20% VAT hidden in the price, but because you didn't pay customs directly, you don't get the tax certificate. You cannot claim that money back on your tax return. You have just voluntarily increased your cost of goods by 20% for absolutely no reason. The verdict? Avoid DDP for commercial imports. DDP is great for sending samples or for B2C e-commerce where the customer is a regular person who can't do customs clearance. But for B2B, stick to DAP. You want to control the customs clearance so you can control your tax efficiency. Okay, that was a lot of information. We walked the entire supply chain, but information is useless without a strategy. So how should you actually structure your logistics? If I were building a supply chain today, here is my playbook, my cheat sheet for a secure shipment. Move number 1, at the origin. I would kill Ex Works immediately. It is legally dangerous. I would switch to FCA seller's premises. This puts the burden of export compliance and loading risk on the seller where it belongs. Move number 2, for the ocean. I would stop using FOB for containers. It creates that invisible risk gap at the terminal. I would use FCA port for the shipping side. Move number 3, for insurance. Or never accept the default clause C insurance that comes with CIF. It's garbage coverage. I would either force the seller to use CIP, which guarantees all risk coverage, or Even better, I would buy my own insurance policy locally so I know exactly who to call if things go wrong. Move number 4 at arrival. I would avoid DDP if I care about my tax returns. I would use DAP. Let the seller do the driving and the logistics, but I will handle the customs clearance. I want to pay the tax so I can reclaim the tax. And one final piece of advice, you are going through all this trouble to negotiate the perfect Incoterm. You are fighting to save that 20% VAT. Do not turn around and lose that margin on bad exchange rates or clumsy international transfers. That is why we use World First. It's not just about paying that supplier in Shenzhen or handling your FX. It's about the whole cycle, collecting your sales from platforms like Amazon, paying for your logistics, and even earning cash back on your ad spend. You need a financial setup that is just as efficient as your supply chain. Logistics is a game of details. The difference between an F and a C or D isn't just a letter on the page. It's the difference between a profitable shipment and a total write-off. Don't just let your supplier pick the default option. Choose your terms on purpose. Thanks for listening. If you want a deeper dive on any of these specific terms, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more operational strategies to help you grow globally, make sure you follow the channel. Now, go check that purchase order.